have three conflict zones in the world right now involving the United States. One is Ukraine. The second is Israel's wars in the Middle East. I'll call them wars because Israel is in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria. And the United States is right there with Israel on everything, including, as you say, the bombing of Yemen and the threats to bomb Iran. The third conflict area, so far a Cold War, if you could put it that way, is with China. But there, too, the administration's rhetoric is utterly bellicose, talking about preparing for possible coming war in most irresponsible and reckless ways. So I had hoped when Trump came into office that he would be a person of peace. I think what he's doing in Ukraine is positive and noteworthy, although a bit clumsy and inconsistent. What he's doing in the Middle East is doubling down on Israel's massacres and complete reckless behavior and war crimes and venality and viciousness, the likes of which we have not seen for a very long time. And what is happening inside the administration, apparently, vis-a-vis China, is a lot of war talk, preparing for war. This is not yet the public face. This is what is apparently being said in semi-private. There seems nothing to be completely private in this administration, but at least this is what the scuttlebutt in Washington is, that there's war talk, war drums beating vis-a-vis China. So, no, this is not an administration of peace. This is an administration that is pursuing, I'd say, multiple and contradictory approaches to American foreign policy.
Jeffrey Sachs provides a grim analysis of U.S. foreign policy, arguing that the country is entangled in three major geopolitical conflicts, all of which have the potential to escalate further. The first is the ongoing war in Ukraine, where the U.S. remains heavily involved by providing military and financial support to Kyiv in its struggle against Russia. The second is Israel's broad military campaign across the Middle East, which includes operations in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and even military actions in Yemen and threats against Iran. The third, and perhaps most dangerous, is the rising tension with China, where the rhetoric coming out of Washington is becoming increasingly aggressive, with policymakers openly discussing the possibility of war. Sachs argues that while each of these conflicts is significant on its own, together they paint a picture of an American foreign policy that is reckless, contradictory, and pushing the world closer to widespread instability. On Ukraine, Sachs acknowledges that Trump's approach is somewhat different from that of his predecessors. Unlike the Biden administration, which was fully committed to arming Ukraine indefinitely, Trump has made moves toward negotiating an end to the war. However, Sachs describes Trump's approach as clumsy and inconsistent. While Trump appears to recognize that continuing the war is not in America's interest, his actions and messaging lack coherence. There is no clear strategy for how to end the war in a way that ensures stability, nor has Trump articulated a vision for what U.S.-Russia relations should look like moving forward. At best, Trump's policy on Ukraine is a step in the right direction, but lacks the depth and strategic foresight necessary to bring about a lasting resolution. In contrast, Trump's approach to the Middle East is far more alarming. Sachs argues that Trump is not just supporting Israel. He is actively enabling and endorsing its most brutal military operations. Israel is engaged in full-scale military campaigns across multiple regions. Gaza, where tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. The West Bank, where settlements and military operations have escalated. Lebanon, where Hezbollah and Israel are exchanging fire. And Syria, where Israeli airstrikes have become routine. On top of that, the U.S. and Israel are also conducting military operations in Yemen and making open threats against Iran. Sachs describes Israel's actions as massacres and war crimes, arguing that the level of destruction and civilian casualties is something the world has not seen in decades. What makes this situation particularly troubling is that the U.S. is not acting as a mediator or a restraining force. Instead, it is providing full military and diplomatic backing to Israel, ensuring that the war continues with no accountability. Sachs sees this as one of the most shameful aspects of U.S. foreign policy, as it not only fuels more violence, but also erodes America's standing in the world. The third conflict Sachs highlights is the growing tension between the U.S. and China. While this has not yet escalated into open warfare, he warns that Washington's rhetoric is becoming increasingly bellicose. Behind closed doors, there are reports that U.S. officials are openly discussing the possibility of war with China, framing it as something the country needs to prepare for. Sachs argues that this kind of talk is not just reckless, but incredibly dangerous. Unlike Ukraine or the Middle East, where the U.S. is engaged in proxy conflicts, a direct military confrontation with China would be catastrophic on a global scale. China is an economic superpower, a major military force, and a key player in global trade. Engaging in open conflict with China would not just disrupt international stability. It would have devastating consequences for the U.S. economy, supply chains, and geopolitical standing. Sachs believes that Trump does not personally want war with China, but he warns that the people around him, advisors, policymakers, and military leaders, are pushing in that direction. If Trump is not careful, he could find himself dragged into a conflict he never intended to start. Sachs' broader point is that the Trump administration's foreign policy is deeply contradictory. On one hand, Trump seems to want to de-escalate in Ukraine, recognizing that continuing the war is a losing proposition. But on the other hand, he is doubling down on full military support for Israel's war machine in the Middle East, making it clear that he has no interest in peace there. Meanwhile, with China, Trump has not yet taken decisive action, but the rhetoric coming from his administration suggests that war is a possibility. This inconsistency, Sachs argues, is dangerous. The U.S. cannot claim to be a force for peace while simultaneously fueling multiple wars. If Trump truly wants to reshape U.S. foreign policy, he needs to take a much stronger stance against those in his administration who are pushing for conflict. He cannot afford to be passive or uninformed, as the consequences of mismanaging these crises could be disastrous. In the end, Sachs does not see this as an administration of peace. Instead, he sees a government pursuing multiple contradictory policies, some of which may lead to even greater instability. While Trump's instincts on Ukraine may be correct, his actions in the Middle East and the rising tensions with China suggest that his administration is still heavily influenced by the same war-driven mentality that has dominated Washington for decades. If Trump truly wants to change that, Sachs argues he will have to fundamentally rethink the direction of U.S. foreign policy before it's too late. According to Jeffrey Sachs, we have 3 conflict zones in the world right now involving the United States. The first is Ukraine. The second is Israel's wars in the Middle East. I'll call them wars because Israel is engaged in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, with the United States fully backing Israel, including bombing Yemen and making threats to bomb Iran. The third conflict area, so far a Cold War scenario, is with China. However, the administration's rhetoric has been utterly bellicose, openly discussing preparations for a potential war in the most irresponsible and reckless manner. I had hoped that when Trump came into office, he would be a president of peace. What he is doing in Ukraine is positive and noteworthy, although a bit clumsy and inconsistent. However, his actions in the Middle East show that he is doubling down on Israel's massacres, reckless behavior, war crimes, and shocking brutality, the likes of which we have not seen in a very long time. Inside his administration, there's also increasing war talk regarding China. While this is not yet the public stance, reports from Washington suggest that discussions about a potential conflict are taking place behind the scenes. This is not an administration of peace. It is one pursuing multiple, contradictory approaches to American foreign policy, increasing global instability. Do you agree with Jeffrey Sachs or not? Drop your comment below. Thanks for watching.